The engine was never supposed to fail. Not this engine. Not inside a $7 million hypercar built for collectors, celebrities, and kings. Yet under the cold, white lights of Hale Luxury Motors, the impossible had already happened. Smoke still lingered in the air as Richard Hale, the ruthless CEO known for never losing a deal, stood silently beside the dead machine while his top engineers backed away one by one. For 3 weeks, the most expensive specialists in the country had torn the engine apart piece by piece, replacing sensors, rewiring systems, rebuilding components that most mechanics would never even touch in their lifetime. But every attempt ended the same way: violent shaking, overheating, then silence. Complete silence. The kind that destroys reputations, the kind that costs millions. Marcus, the dealership's chief technician, wiped grease from his trembling hands before finally admitting the words nobody wanted to hear. "It's over. The engine is done." The room fell still. Richard stared at the motionless machine as the pressure closed around his throat like steel. Investors were already demanding answers. The owner of the car had threatened lawsuits. Social media rumors were spreading faster than the dealership could contain them. If this failure became public, everything Richard had spent 20 years building could collapse in a single week. Finally, with exhaustion burning behind his eyes, he gave the order no CEO ever wanted to give. Scrap the repair. Replace the engine. End the nightmare. Around him, the technicians slowly packed their tools and walked away defeated, believing the battle was finally over. But near the back of the garage, unnoticed by almost everyone, a quiet janitor stopped moving. Daniel Brooks stood there holding a mop in rough, oil-stained hands, listening carefully as the others argued about mechanical failure. His clothes were old. His shoulders looked tired from years of working double shifts. Nobody in the building knew that beneath the silence and exhaustion was a man who once designed engines powerful enough to dominate racetracks around the world. To them, he was just another invisible worker trying to survive long enough to pay rent and raise his little daughter alone. Yet while the experts gave up, Daniel couldn't stop staring at the dead hypercar. Something about the sound they described bothered him. Something small. Something wrong. Hours later, long after the dealership lights dimmed and the storm outside swallowed the city in rain and darkness, Daniel walked back toward the abandoned machine alone. The massive garage echoed with thunder as he placed one hand gently against the cold engine cover and listened. Really listened. Then his eyes narrowed. Hidden beneath layers of failed diagnostics and expensive mistakes, he noticed something no one else had seen. A tiny, irregular burn mark beside a nearly invisible wiring fault. One detail, one impossible detail everyone had missed. And in that moment, while the entire dealership slept believing the engine was dead forever, a single father decided he was going to bring it back to life before sunrise. The rain began before sunrise and never stopped. By late evening, the glass walls of Hale Luxury Motors trembled beneath the weight of the storm outside, each flash of lightning illuminating the silent rows of million-dollar vehicles lined across the showroom floor like monuments to perfection. Usually, the dealership carried an atmosphere of prestige and confidence, a place where wealthy clients walked in believing money could solve anything. But tonight, the building felt different, heavy, suffocating. The air itself seemed filled with failure. Deep inside the private service division, behind security doors marked "Authorized Personnel Only," the sound of metal tools striking concrete echoed through the garage with growing frustration. Mechanics moved quickly around the black hypercar at the center of the room, but nobody spoke unless absolutely necessary. They had already spent 16 straight hours trying to revive the engine, and every failed attempt pushed them closer to humiliation. The car belonged to Victor Carrington, a billionaire collector known for destroying companies with lawsuits whenever something disappointed him. Only 3 prototypes of the vehicle existed in the world, and this particular engine had been custom-built overseas under military-grade secrecy. Replacing it would cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Repairing it now seemed impossible. Marcus Reed stood over the exposed engine bay with sweat rolling down his forehead despite the cold temperature of the garage. He was considered one of the finest performance technicians in the country, a man who had rebuilt championship racing engines before turning 30. His confidence was legendary inside the dealership. Employees trusted him more than they trusted computers. But tonight, even Marcus looked defeated. "Run the diagnostic again," he snapped toward a younger technician standing near the computer terminal. "I already did," the technician answered nervously. 3 times. "Then do it a 4th. The engine suddenly sparked violently as power surged through the system for half a second before dying again. The sharp crack echoed across the garage, forcing everyone to step back. Smoke curled upward from beneath the carbon fiber housing, while warning lights exploded red across the digital dashboard. One mechanic cursed under his breath. Another simply removed his gloves and walked away without saying anything. Marcus closed his eyes slowly as the reality settled deeper into his chest. Nothing worked. Not the rewiring, not the cooling replacements, not the rebuilt ignition assembly. Every solution only created new failures somewhere else inside the machine. It was as if the engine itself refused to live. Upstairs, Richard Hale stood alone in his glass office overlooking the service floor below. The reflection staring back at him in the dark window barely resembled the man whose face appeared on business magazines every year. At 52, Richard had built Hale Luxury Motors into one of the most respected exotic dealerships in America. He was famous for impossible deals, impossible deadlines, and impossible standards. Investors called him brilliant. Competitors called him merciless. But none of that mattered tonight, because for the first time in years, Richard had absolutely no control over what was happening beneath his own roof. His phone buzzed again. Another message from investors. Another headline from automotive blogs speculating about the mysterious engine disaster. Someone inside the dealership had already leaked information online, and rumors were spreading fast. Some articles claimed Hale Motors had destroyed the prototype during unauthorized modifications. Others claimed the company had hired incompetent technicians incapable of handling advanced engineering. Richard threw the phone onto his desk hard enough to crack the corner of the screen. He could survive losing money. He could survive replacing an engine. But public failure? That was different. Reputation was everything in his world. Wealthy clients didn't buy cars from dealerships they didn't trust. One scandal could destroy years of credibility overnight. Behind him, the office door opened carefully. "Sir?" Richard didn't turn around. "What?" His assistant hesitated before speaking. "Mr. Carrington's legal team called again. They want confirmation that the vehicle will be operational before the charity gala this weekend." Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. "Operational?" he repeated. "The damn thing can't survive 30 seconds without shutting down." Silence filled the office. Finally, the assistant asked quietly, "Should I postpone the gala transport?" Richard stared down at the garage floor where mechanics still moved desperately around the dead hypercar. For a moment, he said nothing. Then his shoulders lowered with exhaustion. "No," he said quietly. "Tell them we're replacing the engine." The words tasted like poison the moment they left his mouth. Downstairs, Marcus received the order through his headset and froze in place. Every mechanic in the garage stopped moving when they heard the news. Replace the engine. That meant defeat. Total defeat. Months of engineering analysis wasted. Their reputation as elite specialists shattered in one sentence. Marcus removed his gloves slowly before tossing them onto the workbench. "That's it," he muttered. "We're done." One technician slammed a wrench onto the table in frustration. "We can't just quit!" "You think I want to?" Marcus fired back. "There's nothing left to try." He pointed toward the dismantled engine with growing anger. "We've rebuilt every major system twice. We've replaced parts that weren't even damaged. We flew in specialists from Germany and Japan. Nobody can figure this thing out." Another mechanic stared at the dead engine silently before whispering, "Maybe it was defective from the factory." Marcus shook his head immediately. "No, engines don't fail like this by accident." But even he no longer sounded convinced. Across the room, unnoticed by most of the team, Daniel Brooks quietly pushed a cleaning cart past the service bay. His faded work jacket hung loosely from his tired frame, and the fluorescent lights above reflected against the streaks of grease already covering his hands. He kept his head down as usual while the technicians argued around him. Most employees barely acknowledged his existence anymore. To them, Daniel was simply the overnight janitor, quiet, older than the rest, invisible. But as he passed the hypercar, his eyes lingered on the engine for one extra second. Then another. Something in the earlier electrical crackling still echoed inside his mind. He continued mopping without speaking, but his attention never fully left the vehicle. Nearby, two younger employees whispered while watching Marcus pace furiously around the bay. "I've never seen him like this before," one said. "Nobody has," the other replied. "If Marcus can't fix it, nobody can." Daniel lowered his eyes again and continued working. Yet deep inside, something unsettled him. The symptoms didn't make sense together. Overheating, unstable ignition, random power collapse, system desynchronization. Those failures should not have appeared simultaneously unless something else was interfering beneath the surface. Something smaller, something hidden. But he said nothing. Men like him were not invited into conversations like these. Hours passed. One by one, mechanics gathered their belongings and left the garage in silence. The energy of determination that once filled the room had completely vanished, replaced now by exhaustion and shame. The dealership's giant digital clock displayed 11:47 p.m. when Marcus finally shut down the main diagnostic system. The screens faded to black one at a time, leaving only the dim emergency lighting above the service bays. The dead hypercar sat motionless in the center of the room like a defeated animal surrounded by broken tools. Marcus stared at it for several long seconds before whispering quietly to himself, "I'm sorry." Then he walked away. Upstairs, Richard remained alone in his office long after everyone else had gone home. He loosened his tie slowly while rain hammered against the windows around him. Below, the city lights blurred through the storm like distant ghosts. His father had started Hale Motors with one tiny repair shop 40 years earlier. Richard had transformed it into an empire. Every decision he ever made was built around one rule: never let people see weakness. But tonight, weakness surrounded him from every direction. His investors doubted him, his technicians failed him, and somewhere beyond the walls of the dealership, the internet was already preparing to laugh at him. He poured himself a drink with shaking hands but stopped halfway before taking a sip. Through the office window, he noticed movement down in the dark garage. A lone figure crossed slowly between the silent service bays. The janitor. Richard watched absently as Daniel continued cleaning long after everyone else had left. The man moved with quiet patience, carefully organizing abandoned tools and wiping oil stains from the floor while thunder rolled outside. There was something strangely calm about him, almost disconnected from the panic consuming the rest of the building. Richard looked away after a moment. He had bigger problems than a janitor working overtime. Eventually, near midnight, he grabbed his coat and prepared to leave. Before stepping out, he took one final look toward the dead hypercar below. Millions of dollars, hundreds of headlines, years of reputation, all collapsing because of one machine nobody could fix. The thought tightened painfully inside his chest. "Tomorrow," he whispered bitterly. "We start over tomorrow." Then he turned off the office lights and disappeared into the storm. Downstairs, the dealership fell completely silent for the first time all day. The remaining lights flickered softly above the empty garage, while rainwater tapped rhythmically against the massive windows outside. Daniel stood alone near the service bay with his cleaning cart beside him. For several seconds, he simply stared at the hypercar without moving. The engine compartment remained partially exposed beneath hanging work lights, revealing wires, carbon fiber tubing, titanium components, and layers of engineering complexity that intimidated even elite specialists. Most people would have walked away. Every expert already had. Daniel slowly removed his gloves. His tired eyes moved carefully across the engine, studying every disconnected wire and every burn mark left behind by the earlier failures. Then he stepped closer. Very slowly, he reached out and touched the edge of the engine housing with his fingertips. The metal was still warm. Somewhere inside the massive garage, thunder shook the building again. Daniel listened carefully to the fading electrical hum trapped deep within the machine, and for the first time all night, something changed in his expression. Not confidence, not certainty, but recognition. Like hearing the faint echo of a voice everyone else had ignored. By 6 o'clock the next morning, Hale Luxury Motors had already returned to its usual performance of perfection. The storm outside had faded into a gray drizzle, and the polished showroom floors reflected rows of exotic cars beneath crystal-white lighting as if nothing had happened the night before. Wealthy clients arrived carrying designer umbrellas, while receptionists greeted them with flawless smiles and fresh espresso. On the surface, the dealership still looked untouchable, but behind the glass walls and luxury branding, tension continued spreading through the building like poison. Employees whispered in corners. Technicians avoided eye contact. Everyone had heard about the failed engine. Everyone knew the company was preparing to replace the $7 million powertrain at catastrophic cost. And somewhere above them all, Richard Hale remained locked inside meetings with lawyers, investors, and furious clients, trying desperately to stop his empire from bleeding credibility. Meanwhile, near the rear service entrance where customers never looked, Daniel Brooks quietly pushed open the heavy employee door, carrying a paper bag with his daughter's unfinished breakfast inside. His jacket was still damp from the walk through rain, and exhaustion rested heavily beneath his eyes after barely sleeping the previous night. He paused briefly before entering the garage, listening to the familiar sounds of tools clanging and expensive engines roaring awake across the service floor. Then he lowered his head and walked in unnoticed, just another invisible worker beginning another shift. "Hey, janitor," one mechanic called without looking at him, tossing an empty coffee cup toward a nearby trash bin and missing completely. "Clean that up." Daniel simply nodded and picked it up without a word. The mechanic had already forgotten he existed before Daniel even reached the trash can. That was how most days worked inside Hale Luxury Motors. Men in tailored suits discussed million-dollar transactions, while technicians in branded uniforms argued about horsepower numbers and rare imported components. Everyone there belonged to a world of prestige, money, and status. Everyone except Daniel. His shoes were worn down at the heels. His cleaning cart rattled loudly because one wheel no longer worked properly. Some mornings he skipped breakfast just to make sure Lily had enough food before school. But nobody saw those details. They only saw a quiet, middle-aged man with rough hands and old clothes mopping floors in silence, while successful people walked around him pretending he wasn't there. Daniel preferred it that way most of the time. Invisibility hurt less than pity. Still, there were moments when the distance between his world and theirs became impossible to ignore. Near the center service bay, Marcus stood with several senior technicians discussing the hypercar again, while digital schematics rotated across large monitors mounted on the wall. "Transport arrives tomorrow," Marcus said sharply. "We strip the engine completely tonight and prep for replacement." One younger technician shook his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe it beat us." Marcus looked exhausted. "It didn't beat us. The machine's defective." Another mechanic laughed bitterly. "Try explaining that to a billionaire client." The group exchanged frustrated smiles before Marcus noticed Daniel mopping nearby. "Careful around Bay 3, Marcus warned immediately. "That car costs more than your entire life." Several mechanics chuckled under their breath. Daniel kept mopping quietly as if he hadn't heard the insult at all, but something tightened faintly behind his tired eyes. Marcus wasn't an evil man. Most people at the dealership weren't, but success had taught them all the same lesson for too many years. Important people looked important. Genius dressed expensive. Talent arrived with credentials, confidence, and polished shoes. Men like Daniel existed in the background, carrying trash bags and cleaning oil stains after everyone else went home. Nobody imagined they could possibly understand machines beyond basic labor. A few minutes later, two salesmen entered the garage, escorting wealthy clients eager to tour the private performance division. The customers admired the rows of exotic vehicles, while employees explained horsepower specifications with rehearsed excitement. One sharply dressed man paused beside Daniel, while the janitor knelt cleaning spilled coolant from the floor. "Doesn't smell very luxurious back here," the client joked. The salesman laughed politely. Daniel remained silent, eyes lowered. "You'd think with what they charge for these cars," the man continued, "they could at least hire cleaners who look professional." More laughter. Daniel kept working. He had learned years ago that humiliation became easier when you stopped reacting to it. Across the garage, Marcus resumed discussing the failed hypercar with increasing frustration. "The CEO wants answers by tonight," he said. "And if anyone leaks more information to the press, they're gone." One mechanic glanced toward the dead vehicle sitting isolated beneath protective covers. "Maybe we should have listened when Nakamura said the electrical synchronization looked strange." Marcus shook his head immediately. "We checked synchronization 6 times." Daniel's hand paused for half a second against the floor. "The ignition pattern didn't match thermal behavior," another technician argued. "Maybe there's feedback interference somewhere deeper in the system." Marcus crossed his arms. "Every sensor's been tested." Daniel slowly continued wiping the floor while listening carefully to every word. The more they spoke, the more certain he became that they were looking in the wrong direction entirely. But he stayed silent. Men like him did not interrupt conversations between experts, especially not in places like Hale Motors. Hours later, during lunch break, Daniel sat alone behind the building near the delivery dock, eating a sandwich wrapped in paper, while rainwater dripped from metal gutters overhead. Inside the dealership restaurant upstairs, wealthy clients enjoyed imported wine and chef-prepared meals while discussing investments and vacation properties. Daniel could smell grilled steak drifting down through the ventilation system. He stared quietly at his cheap sandwich before taking another bite. His phone buzzed softly in his pocket. A message from Lily. "Did you remember my science fair tonight?" Daniel closed his eyes briefly. He had promised her he would be there by 6. "I'll make it," he typed back immediately, even though he wasn't sure it was true. A second message appeared moments later. "Love you, Dad." For the first time all day, Daniel smiled faintly. That little girl still believed he could do anything. She didn't care about money or titles or expensive suits. To her, he was simply Dad. The man who fixed broken toys, braided her hair badly every morning, and stayed awake all night when she had nightmares. Sometimes Daniel wondered how long that innocence would survive before the world taught her to judge people the same way everyone else did. He prayed it never happened. Back inside the dealership, pressure continued building throughout the afternoon. Richard Hale stormed through meetings with growing anger while lawyers prepared damage control statements for the media. Investors demanded explanations. The billionaire owner threatened legal action if transportation deadlines failed again. By evening, exhaustion had sharpened everyone's nerves to the breaking point. In the garage, Marcus slammed a diagnostic tablet onto the workbench after another failed systems review. "There is nothing left," he snapped. "We've checked every possibility." Daniel stood nearby, replacing garbage bags quietly when the words escaped before he could stop them. "Not every possibility." The room went silent instantly. Marcus turned slowly toward him. Several technicians stared in disbelief, as if a piece of furniture had suddenly started speaking. "What did you say?" Marcus asked coldly. Daniel hesitated. He immediately regretted opening his mouth. "Nothing." "No," Marcus replied, stepping closer. "You said something." Daniel lowered his eyes again. "I just meant, maybe the issue isn't mechanical." A few mechanics laughed openly now. One whispered, "The janitor's diagnosing hypercars." Marcus folded his arms with visible irritation. "And what exactly would you know about mechanical systems?" Daniel remained quiet. "This isn't some broken lawnmower," Marcus continued sharply. "That engine was built by engineers who forgot more than you'll ever learn." More laughter spread through the garage. Daniel felt heat rising into his face, but he forced himself to stay calm. "I wasn't trying to offend anyone," he said quietly. Marcus stepped even closer until they stood only feet apart. "Then stick to cleaning floors." The words hit harder than Daniel expected, not because they were cruel, but because part of him believed them. Years ago, people had once spoken his name with admiration inside engineering circles. Companies flew him across continents to solve impossible performance failures. Magazine articles called him brilliant. Then came the hospital bills, the funeral, the endless nights holding a crying little girl after her mother died. Dreams disappeared quickly when survival became more important. By the time Daniel finally looked up again, nobody remembered the engineer he used to be. They only saw the janitor he had become. Marcus turned away dismissively, but one younger technician smirked toward Daniel before saying loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Maybe we should hand him the keys. Could save us all some time." The garage erupted with tired laughter again. Daniel forced a weak smile that never reached his eyes and quietly returned to work. Yet behind the humiliation, another emotion had begun growing stronger all day. Certainty. The more he studied the symptoms in his mind, the more convinced he became that the engine failure wasn't random at all. Somewhere inside that machine was a tiny mistake everyone else kept overlooking because they were searching for catastrophic damage instead of subtle imbalance. And subtle problems were always the deadliest. As evening approached, the dealership slowly emptied again. Wealthy clients drove away in polished luxury vehicles, while office lights shut down floor by floor. Richard Hale finally emerged from his office looking older than he had the day before. His tie hung loose around his collar, and dark circles shadowed his eyes from sleepless nights. He paused briefly above the service floor, staring down at the dead hypercar once more. Even from the balcony, he could feel failure radiating from it. Marcus approached him carefully. "Transport team confirmed tomorrow morning," he said. Richard nodded without emotion. "Good. We'll start dismantling at dawn." Richard stared silently at the car for several seconds before asking quietly, "Do you really believe there's no saving it?" Marcus hesitated only briefly. "No one can fix that engine." The answer settled heavily between them. Richard finally nodded once before walking away again without another word. Near the back of the garage, Daniel watched the exchange silently while holding his mop beside the darkened service bay. No one noticed him standing there. No one ever did. But as the final employees prepared to leave for the night, his eyes slowly returned toward the silent hypercar beneath the hanging lights. Somewhere deep inside the dead machine, hidden beneath millions of dollars of engineering and the pride of every expert in the building, he knew the truth was waiting. And for the first time in years, Daniel Brooks felt something dangerous beginning to wake up inside him again. The dealership finally fell silent a little after midnight. One by one, the lights across the upper offices disappeared until only the dim emergency lamps above the service bays remained glowing inside the massive garage. Outside, rain slid slowly down the tall glass windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere beyond the sleeping city. The rows of luxury vehicles sat motionless beneath soft reflections, beautiful and lifeless like sculptures trapped inside a museum. In the center bay, the black hypercar remained half dismantled beneath hanging work lights, abandoned by every expert who had touched it. Daniel Brooks stood alone beside it with his cleaning cart behind him, and his heart pounding harder than it had in years. For a long moment, he did nothing. He simply stared at the engine while the words from earlier repeated endlessly inside his mind. Stick to cleaning floors. He should have walked away. Any sensible man would have. If he touched the vehicle without permission and failed, Marcus would fire him instantly. Richard Hale would probably call security. Worst of all, the humiliation would spread through the dealership by morning. The janitor who thought he could outsmart elite engineers. The poor fool who forgot his place. Daniel closed his eyes briefly and exhaled slowly. Then he looked down at the small photo taped inside his old wallet. Lily smiled back at him, wearing missing front teeth and holding the cheap science trophy she had won the year before. Underneath the photo, written in messy pencil, were the words she once scribbled for him after fixing her broken toy rabbit. "My dad can fix anything." Daniel swallowed hard as emotion tightened painfully in his chest. He had lost almost everything already: his career, his reputation, his future. But he could not lose the last small piece of belief his daughter still carried in her heart. Slowly, he stepped toward the hypercar. The sound of his boots echoed across the empty garage. He carefully placed his cleaning gloves aside and reached for the diagnostic tablet Marcus had forgotten near the workbench. The screen lit up, displaying pages of failed reports, overheating warnings, synchronization errors, ignition instability, power collapse. Daniel studied the pattern silently while rain tapped softly against the windows behind him. The experts had focused on major systems because the failure looked catastrophic, but catastrophic failures rarely appeared without smaller causes hiding underneath. That was the first lesson engineering had taught him decades ago. Machines always whispered before they screamed. Most people were simply too arrogant to listen carefully enough. He moved around the exposed engine slowly, examining each wire and connection with narrowing eyes. His rough fingers traced along carbon fiber housing panels until he reached the same faint burn mark he had noticed earlier. Tiny, almost invisible, but wrong. Daniel grabbed a flashlight and leaned deeper into the engine bay. There. A slight discoloration near the synchronization harness. Barely noticeable unless someone knew exactly what unstable thermal feedback looked like under high compression load. His pulse quickened. "You weren't overheating," he whispered quietly to the dead engine. "You were fighting yourself." He immediately began working. Panels came off carefully one by one as tools clicked softly through the silent garage. Sweat formed across his forehead despite the cold air around him. Every movement carried risk now. If security cameras caught him tampering with the vehicle, he could lose the only job keeping food on Lily's table. But the deeper he went into the engine, the more certain he became. Somewhere inside this machine, something had been assembled slightly wrong from the very beginning. Not broken, misaligned. And because the error was microscopic, every repair attempt had only made the system more unstable. Hours passed unnoticed. Daniel worked carefully beneath the hanging lights while the storm outside continued fading into darkness. Occasionally, pain shot through his stiff hands from years of labor, but he ignored it. The deeper he dug into the synchronization assembly, the more memories returned against his will. He remembered another garage years earlier, filled with race engineers applauding as his prototype engines shattered track records during testing. He remembered reporters crowding around him asking how someone so young could solve problems veteran designers could not. He remembered the pride in his wife Emily's eyes when she used to watch interviews from the front row, smiling like the future belonged to them forever. Then the memories changed. Hospital lights, machines beeping endlessly. Emily growing weaker each day while medical bills destroyed everything they owned. Daniel selling patents, contracts, and eventually his entire career trying to keep her alive long enough for Lily to remember her mother's voice. But cancer did not care about talent, or genius, or promises. By the time Emily died, Daniel no longer recognized the man staring back from mirrors. He stopped designing engines soon after. The world moved on without him surprisingly fast. New engineers replaced him. New articles filled magazines. Eventually, nobody spoke his name anymore. The only thing that kept him alive after that was Lily. Daniel suddenly froze as the memory faded. He had found it. Hidden beneath layers of shielding sat a tiny electronic relay no larger than a coin, installed backward by less than half a degree. To anyone else, it looked perfectly normal. But under extreme load, the microscopic misalignment caused unstable feedback pulses throughout the synchronization network, creating a chain reaction that mimicked catastrophic engine failure. Daniel stared at it in disbelief. One tiny mistake. One nearly invisible flaw buried beneath millions of dollars of engineering. And because the symptoms spread randomly through different systems, every expert had chased the wrong problems. A shaky breath escaped his lips. He was right. But fixing it would still be dangerous. If he recalibrated the synchronization manually and failed, the engine could completely fry itself during ignition. Daniel looked toward the empty garage around him. No voices, no help, no second chances. Only silence and pressure closing around him from every direction. His phone suddenly vibrated in his pocket, startling him. A message from Lily sent hours earlier while he worked. "Good night, Dad. Don't work too hard." Daniel stared at the screen for several seconds before slowly sitting down beside the engine. Exhaustion washed over him all at once. He rubbed trembling hands across his face and closed his eyes tightly. "What am I doing?" he whispered to himself. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe this was foolish. Maybe the world had already decided who Daniel Brooks was supposed to be now. A tired janitor struggling quietly at the bottom, while successful men made important decisions above him. Perhaps chasing the ghost of the man he used to be would only destroy the little life he still had left. Then he remembered Lily standing in the kitchen 3 weeks earlier, holding her broken science project while tears rolled down her cheeks because she thought she had ruined it forever. Daniel had stayed awake until dawn, repairing every damaged piece by hand before surprising her the next morning. She hugged him so tightly afterward that he could barely breathe. "You never give up on broken things," she had whispered. The memory hit him harder than thunder. Daniel slowly stood again. His eyes hardened with quiet determination as he reached for the calibration tools beside the engine. "Not tonight," he said softly into the empty garage. "Tonight, I finish this." The next several hours became war. Tiny adjustments, precision rewiring, manual synchronization resets performed by hand, because the automated systems no longer recognized the corrupted feedback loop. Sweat dripped from Daniel's face onto the engine housing while the clock above the garage crawled closer toward dawn. Twice, the recalibration failed completely, forcing him to start over from the beginning. Once, a sudden electrical surge exploded sparks across the bay and nearly knocked the tools from his hands. But he kept going. Alone, exhausted, terrified. Somewhere around 4:30 in the morning, his fingers began shaking uncontrollably from fatigue. Blood stained one knuckle where sharp metal had sliced through skin hours earlier. His back burned with pain every time he leaned over the engine. Yet he refused to stop, because this was no longer only about the car. It was about proving that failure had not completely erased the man he once was. Proving that Lily's faith in him wasn't misplaced. Proving that invisible people could still matter. Finally, as the first faint traces of dawn began creeping across the city skyline outside, Daniel tightened the last connector into place and stepped back from the engine, breathing hard. Silence swallowed the garage once again. The hypercar sat motionless beneath the dim lights, waiting. Daniel stared at the ignition button for several long seconds, while fear tightened inside his chest. If he was wrong, everything ended here. His job, his dignity, his final shred of hope. Slowly, with trembling fingers, he reached toward the ignition. Daniel closed his eyes for one final second before pressing the ignition button. At first, nothing happened. The garage remained trapped in absolute silence as the system lights flickered softly across the dashboard. Then suddenly, deep inside the hypercar, something awakened. A low vibration rolled through the chassis, one pulse, then another. Daniel's eyes widened as the engine roared violently to life, the sound exploding across the empty garage like thunder breaking through darkness. The entire machine trembled with raw power before settling into a smooth, perfect rhythm that no one had heard since the day the car arrived. Stable temperature, stable synchronization, no warning lights, no system failures, just the deep, flawless growl of a living engine finally breathing correctly again. Daniel stood frozen beside the vehicle, staring at the dashboard as emotion slowly crashed over him all at once. Exhaustion, relief, disbelief. For the first time in years, he felt like himself again. Tears nearly formed in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away with greasy hands as dawn light began spilling softly through the dealership windows. A few minutes later, the first employees entered the garage and immediately stopped in shock. One mechanic dropped his coffee onto the floor. Another stared at the running hypercar like he was hallucinating. "No," someone whispered. "That's impossible." Marcus rushed into the bay seconds later, breathing hard, his face pale from confusion. He looked from the perfectly stable engine to the open tools surrounding Daniel, then back to the dashboard again. The diagnostics were clean, completely clean. Marcus stepped closer slowly, unable to speak. "Who did this?" he finally asked in a broken voice. Daniel quietly wiped his hands with an old rag and looked down at the floor. "The problem wasn't the engine," he said softly. "It was the synchronization relay. It was installed slightly off balance from the beginning." Silence swallowed the room. Every technician stared at him differently now, not like a janitor, not like a nobody, but like a man they had completely failed to see. Upstairs, Richard Hale arrived moments later after hearing the commotion. The instant he heard the engine running, he froze in place. For several seconds, he simply stood there staring at the impossible machine roaring perfectly beneath the morning sunlight. Then his eyes slowly shifted toward Daniel, the quiet janitor with tired clothes and rough hands, the man everyone overlooked. Richard felt something heavy settle deep inside his chest. Shame. All this time, he had measured human value through status, appearance, and success. Yet the only person capable of saving the company had been the man silently cleaning their floors every night. Richard walked toward Daniel carefully, his voice quieter than it had ever been before. "Why didn't you tell anyone who you were?" Daniel looked at the running engine for a moment before answering. "Because nobody was listening." The words hit harder than any accusation. A little later that morning, while sunlight filled the garage for the first time in days, a small girl suddenly ran through the service entrance wearing a backpack almost bigger than herself. "Dad!" Lily shouted happily before throwing her arms around Daniel. He knelt down immediately despite his exhaustion and held her tightly against him. Richard watched silently from across the garage as the little girl smiled proudly at her father. "I knew you could fix it," she whispered. Daniel finally smiled, a real smile this time, the kind that had been buried beneath grief and struggle for years. Around them, the perfect engine continued humming beneath the morning light, and for the first time, everyone inside Hale Luxury Motors understood the truth. Genius does not always wear expensive suits, and sometimes the most extraordinary people are the ones the world never bothers to notice.